I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a more interesting, a more tragic, and a more chaotic election in American history than the 1968 election. Just to get a sense of what it was like to live through that roughly year process of the campaign, let's do a quick timeline. The sitting president at the time is Lyndon Johnson, but Johnson, who had beaten Goldwater resoundingly in 1964, by 1968, when he's going to run again, is not the most popular figure in his party. Vietnam and his continuation of the policies set forth by John F. Kennedy, in many cases endorsed by Republicans, have put him at odds with his party's more liberal leadership. Candidates like Eugene McCarthy have mobilized a student army of hippies who are going, quote, clean for Gene. They are cutting their hair, they're shaving their beards, they're trying to influence the political process. And as a result, this anti-poverty, anti-Vietnam faction within the more liberal wing of the Democratic Party is making Johnson persona non grata, and he's faring very poorly in key states, key early primary states like Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, etc. And so in an unprecedented move, Johnson on March 31st, 1968, announces that he's withdrawing his name for consideration, that he's no longer going to seek the office of the presidency for the 68 election, and that he is just going to serve out the remainder of his term. It opens a massive power vacuum amongst McCarthy, Hubert Humphrey, his sitting vice president, and many other candidates, including Robert F. Kennedy, who we're going to talk about today. But just a week later, April 4th, 1968, tragically in Memphis, Tennessee, Martin Luther King is shot and killed. And so in the same news week, you have Johnson's massive announcement he's withdrawing from the presidency, the tragedy of King's death. Just 2 months later, June 4th, 1968, Robert F. Kennedy, after winning the California primary, the biggest primary to date, is killed immediately following his victory speech. Just 2 months after that, we have the disaster, the epic disaster of the 1968 Democratic National Committee. The convention in Chicago shows hundreds of people injured in the streets, thousands of people protesting in the streets, and untold numbers of people arrested in the streets. There's violence inside the convention halls as reporters like Dan Rather are punched in the stomach randomly by passersby. And then there's, of course, violence between police dogs, with policemen with SWAT team gear and riot hoses, and conflicts with protesters. And so it seems like the party itself is breaking in two as establishment candidates who want to continue Johnson's legacy in Vietnam, like Hubert Humphrey, who ends up winning through a backdoor deal, are militarily and physically, in some cases, opposed to the more liberal anti-poverty, anti-Vietnam faction, which is increasingly led by McCarthy, who came in second in the backdoor deal that swung the convention nomination to Humphrey. And then again, just a few months later, the American left is silenced as Nixon wins a squeaker over Humphrey. So we're not going to talk about Nixon in this lecture, and we're not going to talk about Humphrey, but we're going to talk about 1968, the tragedies of 1968. In particular, the argument I want to make to you is that there was this kind of amazing promise, this unmet promise, because of the assassination of RFK, of Robert F. Kennedy's campaign, that Robert F. Kennedy, more than any of the other liberal, anti-poverty, anti-Vietnam candidates in that section of the party, that he was able to find his voice, a kind of new, non-violent conviction that he was able to use to persuade audiences and win primaries more so than other anti-establishment candidates like McCarthy. And he did that only after he gave this powerful eulogy that I'll show you for Martin Luther King, the day that King was shot, April 4th, when Kennedy was scheduled to give a normal campaign stump speech that he scrapped at the last moment, and he gave a historic, powerful, and very ethical eulogy. And I think at that moment, he was able to find his voice and find a new campaign message premised on the idea of working together non-violently to achieve the greater promise that he saw for America at the time. And so this lecture is about 3 months between Kennedy's arrival on the scene as just an also-ran candidate amongst the American left and his ascension to the front runner before he's killed in early June of 1968.